Well, welcome to the afternoon session of our conference. I'm so glad to have you all here. My name is Jeff Barbeau, and I am Associate Professor of Theology and Coordinator of the MA in Theology here at Wheaton College. It is my pleasure to introduce two papers by scholars who are known for their ability to translate and clarify Bonhoeffer's thought for a wider audience. So I think that's a real treat. After these papers, of course, there will be again time for question and answer, and I'm sure that will be vigorous and interesting. Our first speaker is Dr. Lori Brandt Hale. She is Associate Professor of Religion and Director of General Education at Augsburg College in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hale serves on the steering committee for the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Theology and Social Analysis Group of the American Academy of Religion, serves as the secretary for the International Bonhoeffer Society in the English language section, and is the co-author of Dietrich Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians. Dr. Hale will present a paper titled Bonhoeffer's Christological Take on Vocation, Exploring His Ethics as Formation and Responsibility. Please welcome Dr. Hale.
Good afternoon. It is such a privilege to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. What I cannot get over for me personally is the way this opportunity, a conference framed as Bonhoeffer, Christ, and Culture, is bringing together my work on Bonhoeffer with my work over the last 10 years in the classroom. In 2002, my college, Augsburg College, redesigned its general education curriculum to better reflect the mission and vision of that place. At the same time, the college was a new recipient of a Lilly Endowment-funded grant for the theological exploration of vocation, an idea that fit very well with the college commitments to faith and service, among other things. The result, in part, was the creation of two core courses housed in the religion department called Christian Vocation and the Search for Meaning, 1 and 2. A senior Keystone experience, revisiting vocation in particular, was also developed. So in the Search for Meaning courses, we introduced Christian theology as well as basic tenets of other major world religious traditions, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And we explore, with levels of complexity that increase from the first course to the second, the rich concept of vocation. But it is no easy task. A traditional Catholic understanding of vocation certainly emphasizes the idea that a vocation is a calling, particularly a calling from God, but it also relegates that call to one of religious life, to priesthood, the diaconate, or life in a religious order. Martin Luther, appropriately, Augsburg is a Lutheran institution, guides our understanding of vocation out of the cloister, as it were, and into the world. He asserts that all have a calling from God to service in the world, and famously gives the example that cobblers, Christian cobblers, are called not to put little crosses on the shoes they make, but to craft good, reliable footwear. At the same time, Luther's work makes it clear that vocation is about our core identity, shaped by grace and faith alone, and not about what we do or achieve in the world. Moreover, freed by the saving act of Christ on the cross from the constant pursuit of righteousness and even salvation, humans, men and women, can live in service to the neighbor and to the world. Well, for students, we have translated this understanding of vocation into a visual, a triangle, with God, the caller, at one point, the self, with particular interest and skills, at one point, and the neighbor or world with challenges and needs at the third point. In the intersection of these three, God, self, and world, one's vocation comes into view. It is a great place to start the conversation. But it is not a great place to end the conversation. Is vocation something I do something I have, need to find? The formulaic nature of the triangle certainly makes it seem that way. But what if I don't find it or don't hear the call? Will my life be vocationless? Ironically, Luther was trying to move away from a good works theological model in which doing particular things had salvific efficacy. And I do think Luther got it right. I mean, in a fundamental way, Luther was suggesting a view of vocation rooted in a theology of the cross that is about a way of being in the world. But the message for students is, at best, mixed. Now, other voices in our conversation about vocation have offered a range of ways for students to consider the concept, but either do not address the challenges proffered by the model described above, or introduce new complications, or both. Friedrich Buechner, a popular writer and theologian, maintains that vocation, the place God calls you to, is where one's deep gladness meets the world's deep need. It is an attractive idea, but riddled with a host of problems. Is vocation something, some job, some limited activity? My vocation lies in the intersection of the world's need and my own deep gladness. Again, I have that question, what if I don't find it? Is there only one vocation for me? And what if the world's deep need requires me, bids me to act against my own best interest? What if I am called, say, to participate in a conspiracy to take down a tyrant? My own deep gladness seems a problematic criterion for serving the world. Parker Palmer, also a writer, conversely moves us away from the potential stasis of the models that emerge from Luther and Buechner, or pseudo-Luther and Buechner. Palmer sees vocation as reclamation of one's true and authentic self. In fact, he says that the deepest vocational question is not what ought I to do with my life, but who am I and what is my nature? He captures the possibility that vocation is not something I have or need to find, but a way of being in the world, a hermeneutic for everything I do. To my mind, this view, in the midst of life that is messy and dynamic, joyful and sometimes tragic, is a fruitful way of thinking about vocation. But what constitutes the ground of that self, that authentic selfhood, is largely absent in Palmer. Moreover, the sense that vocation is a call or a calling is also largely absent, and that concerns me. Now, in an interesting way, Palmer hints at that grounding while vindicating, as it were, Buechner's emphasis on deep gladness. Palmer writes, Buechner's definition starts with the self and moves towards the needs of the world. It begins wisely where vocation begins, not in what the world needs, which is everything, but in the nature of the human self, in what brings the self joy, the deep joy of knowing that we are here on earth to be the gifts that God created. Palmer goes on to say that Buechner's attention to gladness is not selfish. Quote, the Quaker teacher Douglas Steere was fond of saying that the ancient human question, who am I, leads inevitably to the equally important question, whose am I? For there is no selfhood outside relationship. We must ask the question of selfhood and answer it as honestly as we can, no matter where it takes us. Only as we do so can we discover the community of our lives, end quote. Now, I like the question, whose am I? And I agree with the premise that there is no selfhood outside relationship, but I am not satisfied. We must ask the question of selfhood and answer it as honestly as we can, no matter where it takes us. What does that mean? Bonhoeffer's view of vocation does not leave me wanting. He posits vocation as responsibility, that is, as a response to the call and claim of Jesus Christ on my life. Embedded within Bonhoeffer's understanding of vocation is really the whole of his theology: costly grace, discipleship, Stellvertretung, ethics as formation, this worldly Christianity. It is not easily unpacked, nor easily dismissed. Moreover, this rich understanding of vocation that truly synthesizes Bonhoeffer's work and life proffers an understanding of the relation between Christ and culture that deems H. Richard Niebuhr's classic categories on the subject beside the point. I quote, "Because in Jesus Christ, God and humanity became one," writes Bonhoeffer in Ethics. "So through Christ, what is quote-unquote Christian and what is quote-unquote worldly become one in the action of the Christian. They are not opposed to each other like two eternally hostile principles. Instead, the action of the Christian springs from the unity between God and the world and the unity of life that have been created in Christ." Now, Bonhoeffer writes explicitly about vocation and responsibility in a section of his Ethics titled History and Good. More precisely, we find this work in a second manuscript titled History and Good. Many of you will recall that Bonhoeffer's work on ethics was in progress at the time of his death and was pieced together and published posthumously. The second manuscript revisits themes introduced in the brief first draft, but adds considerable substance and includes sections that are important for a deep understanding of his claims about vocation. Of particular note are the sections claiming Christ as our life and defining responsibility in Christological terms. They provide the foundation for understanding Bonhoeffer's Christological take on vocation. So in the remainder of our time together, I want to spend some time with these sections of Bonhoeffer's text, as well as draw some brief points of connections with the rest of his theological work. But let me set it up this way. Two questions related to vocation have occupied my thoughts in and out of the classroom over these last years. Does the theological exploration of vocation proffer a view of vocation that claims it as a hermeneutic, that is, a way of orienting oneself in and to the world as well as in relationship to God and others? Or does the theological exploration of vocation proffer a view of vocation that rescues the idea of vocation from extremes in either direction, that is, a predetermined path or role, perhaps a religious one, on one hand that I must identify correctly, or a reduction to ethics in some traditional understanding of that term on the other? In the end, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's work allows me to answer both questions in the affirmative, and thereby offers a way of thinking about vocation that is meaningful, challenging, and deserving of much broader airplay, as it were. The question about the good always finds us in an irreversible situation. We are living. These are the opening words of this History and Good section, and they are loaded. Vocation for Bonhoeffer has both theological and ethical characteristics and implications. So he starts here with this idea of the good. But you know, if you have read other parts of Bonhoeffer's ethics, that this question about the good has to point to this irreversible situation, this we are living, because the question about the good is actually the wrong ethical question. For Bonhoeffer, the ethical question is not what does it mean to do good, but what is the will of God? Now, if you were like me and you have seen the Bonhoeffer documentary by Martin Doblmeier and Journey Films about 1,000 times, or maybe just 15 or 20, you can picture South African theologian John de Grootje in his bright blue shirt talking about this. You with me on this? With almost a chuckle, he remarks that this question, what is the will of God, sounds anachronistic in our ears. But he helps us understand that Bonhoeffer is overturning the history of ethics. That is, he is challenging traditional ethical systems based on abstract and or universal principles. Quote, ethical thought, Bonhoeffer writes, is still largely dominated by the abstract notion of an isolated individual who, wielding an absolute criterion of what is good in and of itself, chooses continually and exclusively between this clearly recognized good and an evil recognized with equal clarity, end of quote. But Bonhoeffer is incredulous. No such person exists. No such criterion exists. And good and evil do not appear in anything like a pure form in history. The familiar Who Stands Fast section of his well-known essay After 10 Years, sent as a letter of support to his co-conspirators and marking 10 years of Hitler's rule, begins like this. The great masquerade of evil has played havoc with all our ethical concepts. For evil to appear as light, charity, historical necessity, or social justice is quite bewildering to anyone brought up on our traditional ethical concepts. So one of the challenges of Bonhoeffer's own National Socialist context was that no facile way to identify what was good and what was evil existed. It just was not that simple. But Bonhoeffer's point is, it is that simple. People do not live in an abstraction. They live in real historical situations that call for real actions and ethical agency. So put another way, ethics in the abstract are not ethics at all. They miss the point. In Bonhoeffer's view, ethics in the abstract removes ethical problems from real life to a static formula without relation to life that is lived and experienced in a particular time and place. Those who try to live this way, that is depending on abstract principles, define the good only in relation to those principles. So it, the good, too, remains an abstraction. Moreover, their so-called ethical decisions take no account of the other person, and require either a privatization of life, a retreat from existence altogether, and Bonhoeffer does have monastic life in mind here, or alternatively, creates a religious fanaticism that is equally not grounded on real life or genuine encounter with actual human beings. Bonhoeffer's ethics and his understanding of vocation depend on both real life and genuine encounter. Now, it is important to note that genuine encounter with and between human beings is a theme in the framework of Bonhoeffer's ethical and theological thinking from the beginning of his work. In his dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, he claims the social intention of all the basic Christian concepts. In other words, he posits the sociality of theology and asserts that human beings exist only in relationship to and responsibility for other human beings. More explicitly, he says that in this encounter with another, that other makes an ethical claim on me, and I am called to respond. In other words, Bonhoeffer's ontology is relational. For him, a person is only in relationship, encounter, and response with another person. But it is not a direct relationship. It is a mediated relationship. It is mediated by the divine you, God, and by that he actually means that it is mediated by the incarnate God, Jesus Christ. Thus, from the beginning of his work in 1927, Bonhoeffer's ontology is also Christological. Now, for those of you who are well-versed in Bonhoeffer, this visitation or revisitation of some of these most basic claims is not novel. It's certainly not earth-shattering. But in light of my work and my campus conversations in particular on vocation, this brief rehearsal of Bonhoeffer's ethical, theological, and Christological foundations is really nothing short of exciting. Bonhoeffer's contributions on this topic are critical in addressing a number of challenges and frustrations, the one I mentioned earlier, in part because he does not reduce vocation to one category, ethics or theology, for example. His understanding of the essential nature of humanity is a key to a more complex view of vocation. And then I'd like to note the continuity between his dissertation work in 1927 and the drafts of ethics in the early 1940s on this essence. I skipped a line. His understanding of the essential nature of humanity is a key to a more complex view of vocation. All right, I want to emphasize this essential nature of humanity. There's a continuity in his work from 1927 to the 1940s on this essence and its identification with Jesus Christ, and that continuity is remarkable. In Sanctorum Communio, he writes, quote, "The Christian person achieves his or her essential nature only when God does not encounter the person as a you, but enters into the person as I. The self-revelation of God in Christ makes this entering possible." So let me say it this way. Essential human nature is linked inextricably with the vicarious act and the vicarious death of Christ on behalf of humanity. As scholar Clifford Green notes, Bonhoeffer builds up his argument to the position where humanity as a whole is the I standing before God as the you. Adam then represents and personifies created and fallen humanity before God And Christ represents and personifies God before humanity and the new humanity before God. It goes in both directions. In other words, Christ reveals God to humanity and at the same time stands as the new I in whom all humanity participates. So the self, the I, is reconfigured Christologically. Christ is the center of one's being or coming into being. Now, in this view, there is a difference between ethical being and essential humanity. The former, ethical being, comes about in a concrete situation, in a particular time and place. Essential humanity, with its Christological restructuring, is not tied to historical circumstance. So, in ethics, the Christological reconfiguration encompasses the whole of life. Jesus says, I am the life. And this claim about reality is one that we cannot ignore. This revelation and proclamation of Jesus Christ is the proclamation. This is Bonhoeffer's words. This is Bonhoeffer's thinking on this, right? Let me say it one more time. This revelation and proclamation of Jesus Christ is the proclamation that our lives are outside ourselves and in Jesus Christ. We do not come to this understanding on our own. It comes to us from outside. It encounters us. And when we are struck by it, we recognize that we have fallen from life, from our life. We recognize that we live in contradiction to our life. In this word of Jesus Christ, we thus hear the no spoken over our life. Rather, we still live from the life called Jesus Christ, the life that is the origin, essence, and goal of all life and of our life. The no spoken over our fallen life becomes a hidden yes to new life. All right, that's a lot to take in. The new I in which we all participate is Bonhoeffer's earlier formulation. We see hints of grace in this articulation as well, for Christ as life is the life we cannot give ourselves. It comes from outside. It is a gift. Quote, nevertheless, it is not a distant and strange life unrelated to us, but our own real daily life, end quote. In Bonhoeffer's words, again I quote, it is the yes of creation, reconciliation and redemption, and the no of judgment and death over life that has fallen away from its origin, essence, and goal. So, that is to say, we live in a dialectical unity of the yes and no. We live, again in Bonhoeffer's words, now stretched between the no and the yes. We live stretched now. We lived now stretched between the no and the yes. We live in the contradictory unity marked by the already accomplished reconciliation of the world to God in Christ's saving act, responsive to the call of God and neighbor and world. This dynamic response, Christological in its origin and ethical in its outcome, is a powerful way to frame the idea and call of vocation. So what it means to live starts to become synonymous with a profound sense of vocation as an orientation to the world, as life that shapes the whole of that life. We live means that in our encounter with other human beings and with God, the yes and no are bound together in a unity of contradiction, in selfless self-assertion, and in a self-assertion that is a surrender of myself to God and to other human beings. Moreover, the unity of life in Christ, the interplay of the yes and no, happens over and over and over again in concrete reality, that is, in real life. So the emphasis on concrete reality slams us up against Bonhoeffer's own incredibly difficult historical reality. It is no wonder that he said sometimes the responsible action requires a person It is no wonder that he said sometimes the responsible action requires a person to choose between right and wrong or good and evil, but more often it asks for a choice between two rights or two wrongs. Regardless, to be responsible is to live one's life as an answer to the life of Jesus Christ, as the yes and no of our life. In After 10 Years, Bonhoeffer asserts, the ultimate question for a responsible person to ask is not how is he going to extricate himself heroically from the affair, but how the coming generation is to live. Well, this kind of responsible life, a life responsive to the call of Christ and the call of neighbor, is made possible by Christ's vicarious representative act. Stellvertretung. Christ acted vicariously on behalf of all humanity, taking on the sin and guilt of the world. In so doing, he freed us, and he freed us to do the same. He freed us to act vicariously on behalf of others and to take on guilt in that responsible act. Only months before Bonhoeffer was sent to Tegel prison, he wrote, this again is in the After 10 Years essay, "Only now are Germans beginning to discover the free responsibility. It depends on a God who demands responsible action in a bold venture of faith and who promises forgiveness and consolation to the one who becomes a sinner in that venture." He echoes the sentiment in Ethics, where he writes, "Those who act responsibly place their action into the hands of God and live by God's grace and judgment." Well, the implications for vocation are striking. Vocation, understood as responsibility, replete with freedom from sin and death, and thereby willingness to take on sin and death, opens the door to acting on behalf of others in significant ways. But not every concrete reality and need will require service unto death. Quote, "The attention of the responsible people is directed to concrete neighbors and their concrete reality. Their behavior is not fixed in advance and for all by a principle." This attention to the real needs of real people is an effective summary of Bonhoeffer's notions of ethics as formation. He writes, "Christ did not, like an ethicist, love a theory about the good. He loved real people. Christ was not interested, like a philosopher, in what is generally valid, but in that which serves real, concrete human beings. Christ was not concerned about whether the maxim of an action could become my principle of a universal law, but whether my action now helps my neighbor now to be a human being before God." Ethics, responsible action, even maybe especially vocation, should not be about what the good is, can be, or should be for each and every time, but about how Christ may take form among us today and here. Reading Bonhoeffer on vocation, on responsible action, even on living in this contradiction or tension between the yes and the no to one's own life, is a challenge, because we know that in his context in life, in his response to the call and claim of Christ on his life, he gave up his life. So maybe it is hard to imagine ourselves following after Bonhoeffer's example. But he would be the first to say that every concrete situation, every real person we encounter, calls us to consider anew what constitutes responsible action and how Christ may take form among us here today. Before I close, I'd like to tell you a story. And it is a story in which at least one, I would argue, but maybe all, the key characters respond ethically and responsibly and perhaps most importantly, Christologically, in Bonhoeffer's understanding of those terms, in relationship to one another. It's a true story, and I'm going to let you decide for yourself if you think that's the case or where those places of connection with this framework might in fact fall. She was talking about forgiveness, about the human inability to forgive absolutely. She was supposed to be talking about this theme. I had assigned it. Together, we had been reading two texts on the themes of forgiveness and reconciliation, one by a theologian at Yale, a Croatian national, and the other by a South African theologian thinking through post-apartheid realities and possibilities. Each student had chosen an individual topic for research papers, but all had to incorporate one or the other or both of these themes. So, my 50-plus-year-old non-traditional student began to tell of her project and her doubts about the possibilities of forgiveness. A young student in the class, 19 or 20, sitting to her left, joined the conversation. He was much more hopeful, optimistic even, that forgiveness is real and present, certainly possible with God's help. I locked eyes with my older student. I knew her. She had been in 2 previous classes with me. She didn't disagree with the last point, but she had lost sight of God's promises. He kept talking. He recognized his own youth and began speculating about whether he'd had enough life experience, really, to test his views on the matter. I lost track of everything he said. I was still holding the gaze of Marlene, pleading with my eyes for her to share the story that had left her with so many doubts. She couldn't. We both knew her silence let Tony's words echo emptily in the room. But no one else seemed to notice our moment. 2 weeks passed. A small group of our class had gathered to workshop their papers. Marlene went last. She began to review the basic claims of her paper, then stopped. She took a deep breath and said, "I have to tell you a story." Slowly and carefully, she began to tell the story of the loss of her son. How he'd been coming home from work, how they'd had a funny conversation at her kitchen table the day before, how he'd been killed instantly, how the juvenile driver, stoned, had been given community service and probation, how she couldn't find it in her heart to forgive the irresponsible kid, how she'd been struggling with her faith, how she thought that God might be able to forgive, but she had come to understand that humans do not have that capacity. Sorry. Everyone was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly and respectfully, Peter said, 7 years ago, a person, forgave me for something I did, even though I didn't deserve it. And it changed my life. It transformed me, and that forgiveness has a positive impact on my life every single day. He didn't say what he did or who forgave him. He didn't need to. But he did open the door for Tara to speak. She was sitting next to Marlene. She turned to her and began, "When I was 16 years old, I hit and killed a 6-year-old child with my car." Words are inadequate to express the weight and import of her words. A profound silence surrounded us. I think it was prayerful silence. Tara didn't cry. I might. Sorry. But the tears began to flow down Marlene's cheeks. She asked Tara if she would share what happened. It was a split-second misjudgment, a young girl trying to follow her sister across a country road. No drugs, no alcohol. We fell silent again. In July of 1944, one day after the conspiracy's failed assassination attempt on Hitler's life, but unbeknownst to Bonhoeffer, Dietrich wrote a very important letter to his friend and confidant, Eberhard Bethke. I discovered later, and I'm still discovering right up to this moment, that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. By this worldliness, I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. In so doing, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God and the world. Watching with Christ in Gethsemane, that, I think, is faith. That is metanoia, or transformation, and that is how one becomes a human and a Christian. And that is how one embraces vocation as a hermeneutic that calls us to responsible action and faith simultaneously in the world, in relationship to God through Christ, and in relationship to others. In short, this perspective may be the one from which we live. It is the beginning of what we might call a vocation-driven life. Thank you.